Welcome to the Warsaw Security Forum. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska and you're watching TVP World. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome to our studio here at the forum my next guest, Oleksandra Matviichuk, head of the Center for Civil Liberties. Thank you for joining me here.
Thank you for the invitation.
So you're focusing on leading the Center for the Civil Liberties in Kyiv, where you play a critical role when it comes to documenting the war crimes. And war crimes are exactly what I would like to start our conversation with. So as we're looking at everything that's happened so far to the civil society on the hands of Russian invaders, do you think that Russia is actually ever truly going to pay for the war crimes it committed? And how actually could the international community aid Ukraine in that pursuit?
We're faced with enormous amount of crimes. Russian troops deliberately shell residential buildings, schools, churches, museums and hospitals. They attack in evacuation corridors. They torture in people infiltration camps. They forcibly take in Ukrainian children to Russia. They ban Ukrainian language and culture. They abducting, robbing, raping and killing civilians in the occupied territories. And all this hell became possible because Putin and his surrounding took leadership decision and started this war. And that is why they have to be punished for the crime of aggression. And that is why we need international community to support the creation of special tribunal on aggression to hold these people accountable.
So what sort of legal tools would have to be used to have that actually take place, to create that tribunal?
In the end of June this year, Council of Europe signed agreement with Ukraine about creation of the special tribunal on aggression. And this is revolutionary because the only existing example in the history of humankind, it was Nuremberg trial, but it was created only after Nazi regime had collapsed. And that is why it's a new standard which shows that justice is not privileged to winners and there is no necessity to wait when and how the war will end. So the next stage is we need countries to join to the special tribunal. And I hope that all countries who believe in freedom and justice will be on the board.
So we're talking about the tribunal and we're talking about the crimes that have already taken place, but how do we establish a certain system where we know that Ukrainian civilians could be better protected?
It's a good question, because when we speak about people in Russian occupation, they have no protection at all. Millions of people live in gray zone without any tools how to defend their rights, their freedom, their property, their lives, their children, their beloved ones. And Russian occupation, it's horrible. It's not just changing one state flag to another. Russian occupation means enforced disappearances, torture, rape, denial of your identity, forcible adoption of your own children, filtration camps and mass graves. So international community must push Russia to decrease the level of brutality of human rights violations and stop such practice.
One of the very, very terrible elements of that oppression that you mentioned was actually having children being abducted and being placed in Russian families. So we know that Russia has illegally transferred at least 20,000 Ukrainian children to various regions of Russia, to various families and territories occupied since 2014. So you can definitely state that Russia is conducting this sort of a cruel experiment of taking Ukrainian children and trying to Russify them. We've heard from Alexander Stubb, for example, Finland's president, about it in the UN as well. Is it possible, do you think, in the future, once the war is over, to be able to locate these children and bring them back home?
The truth is that we have no time. The children lost their childhood. We lost these children. One example, in December last year, one Ukrainian teenager from occupied territories who was illegally transported to Russia, separated with his sister, and was forcibly put to Russian family. He commits suicide. Because what is not visible, that Russian families take Ukrainian children, not because they want Ukrainian children, but because Russia is pretend to be great, but it's very poor. A lot of people live in unbelievable poverty. So they take Ukrainian children just to receive money from Russian budget. And they put Ukrainian kids in very vulnerable situation. They appear in a family which don't love them, don't need them. They are very vulnerable against sexual abuse, about physical violence. So we have no time. We must act now.
And how could countries such as Poland, which is a close ally and neighbor to Ukraine, support Ukraine in its fight for democracy, to be able to sort of extend this umbrella of security over the civil society and in the country's fight for democracy?
We have to be very clear about what Putin's want. He started this large-scale war not because he wants to occupy just another piece of Ukrainian land. He wants to occupy and destroy the whole Ukraine and move further. He sees Ukraine as a bridge to Europe. He will want to attack next European country because he dreams about his legacy and want to forcibly restore Russian Empire. So we must demonstrate strength to make Putin understand that it's impossible for him to achieve his goal. In another way, he will just postpone it for months or for years.
So you mentioned the strength, but what do you think if you were to pinpoint certain elements that, for example, Poland, where we currently are for the Warsaw Security Forum, could do for the civil society and for democracy in Ukraine? What would that be, do you think?
There is no magic button, but we need decisive actions. Poland must join to special tribunal and aggression, and I know that Polish leadership has already told that they will be in the board. We need help of Poland to make EU to do the very important decision to confiscate Russian frozen assets. We have 300 billion euro of Russian money in Europe. It's very obvious that we must confiscate it and use it for defense, for reconstruction of Ukraine, for compensation of victims of Russian war crimes.
Absolutely.
So there are different kinds of decisive actions, and the problem is not that governments don't know what has to be done. The problem is whether or not this government will take leadership position and will do it.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you relates to the governmental structure within Ukraine, the domestic government under Volodymyr Zelensky in this very particular situation after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Recently, we've heard from President Zelensky, who said he won't seek a re-election after the war is over, and he will push for elections during potential ceasefire. Why do you think this is an important move from a democratic standpoint?
Because war is a poison. War is a poison for democracy because war has its own logic. And this logic is opposite to the logic of democratization because the logic of the war dictates centralization. The logic of democratization dictates decentralization. The logic of the war dictates that you have to limit human rights and freedoms due to security requirements. For example, we have curfew in my native city, Kiev. The logic of democratization dictates that you have expand the space for human rights and freedoms. So we're stuck between these two logics, logic of the war and logic of democratization, try to balance, because we have no luxury to postpone both tasks, either to protect our country or to do democratic reforms. So when we will have ceasefire and then sustainable peace, for sure it's needed to make election and to restart the system.
Do you think that Ukrainians are going to be ready and in a certain mental space to be able to go to the voting polls and decide on the next president after such a extended period of being under one leadership, but at the same time suffering from the atrocities of the war?
I will remind our audience how important its right to vote is for Ukrainians. Because 20 years ago, we have Orange Revolution, and millions of people in Ukraine protested when their right of vote was stolen by pro-Russian government. So it's something very essential and core for Ukrainian democracy. So I have no doubt that people will come and vote.
Do you think that at any point in time, let's say the ceasefire is reached, let's say the war comes to an end, do you think it will be possible for Ukrainians to actually Kremlin-proof themselves to make sure that Russia never strikes again?
We need to create solid guarantees because we have this sad history that we got Budapest Memorandum instead of disarmament of nuclear arsenal of Ukraine. And Ukraine, I will remind all of us, that has the third in the world nuclear arsenal. And what we get instead, we get paper with title Budapest Memorandum, but no real security guarantees. So now we need something essential, not to repeat the story.
Thank you very much. It was great to have you in the studio to discuss these very important issues. As I mentioned, civil society and democracy is what will eventually have to lead after the ceasefire and after the war is over. Thank you once again for joining me in the studio.
Thank you for this conversation.
And so my guest was Oleksandra Matviichuk, head of the Center for Civil Liberties, also awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022 for her courageous human rights work. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska. Thank you so much for joining me here, and please do stay tuned here on TVP World.